June 1st, 1666. The North Sea. Two massive fleets, English and Dutch, over 150 warships combined, were closing in on each other. What was about to begin would break every rule of naval warfare. Admirals would fight past the point of exhaustion. Sailors would man their guns through multiple sunsets. Ships would keep firing even as they sank. And when it finally ended, if it ended, one question would haunt both nations. How did we survive that? This is the 4 days battle, the longest continuous naval engagement ever fought. The battle that showed what happened when two maritime superpowers refused to stop fighting, and the 4 days that nearly bankrupted England while establishing the Dutch Republic as a naval force that could challenge the world's greatest fleet. Welcome to Britain's history. Today, we're diving into a battle that defied every convention of naval warfare, a fight so long that sailors fought through multiple sunsets, so brutal that admirals kept fighting with half their fleets sunk, so close that it came down to which nation's sailors could endure more punishment before their bodies simply gave out. But before we get to those 4 days of hell, before we watch English and Dutch ships tear each other apart in the longest engagement in naval history, we need to understand how two Protestant trading nations that should have been natural allies ended up in their second war in 5 years. Because without knowing why England and the Dutch Republic hated each other so intensely, you can't appreciate the fury that drove men to fight for 96 hours straight. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more forgotten battles lined up, each one as dramatic as the 4 days battle. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1651, when England passed the Navigation Acts, laws designed to destroy Dutch commercial dominance. The acts stated that goods imported to England or its colonies had to be carried on English ships or ships from the country of origin. This was aimed directly at the Dutch, who dominated European shipping by carrying everyone else's goods in their massive merchant fleet. The Dutch Republic in the 1660s was the wealthiest nation in Europe per capita. Amsterdam was the world's financial center. Dutch merchants controlled global trade from the East Indies to the Americas. Their vast merchant fleet, over 16,000 ships, carried everything: Baltic grain, Spanish wool, French wine, colonial spices. They were the middlemen of world commerce, and they charged handsomely for it. England resented this. English merchants watched Dutch ships carry English goods, enriching Amsterdam while London struggled. The Navigation Acts were economic warfare. Force trade into English ships, break Dutch commercial power, make London the world's trading center instead of Amsterdam. Think about this for a moment. You're a Dutch merchant in the 1660s. For generations, your family has built wealth through trade. You've invested in ships, warehouses, trade networks spanning the globe. Then England passes laws specifically designed to bankrupt you. How do you respond? Accept economic destruction? Or fight back? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The Dutch fought back. The First Anglo-Dutch War, 1652 to 1654, was brutal. Dozens of naval battles, thousands dead, commerce disrupted. England won militarily, but couldn't achieve its economic goals. The Dutch merchant fleet was too large, too efficient, too well protected. Trade continued. Amsterdam remained dominant. By 1665, tensions had rebuilt to breaking point. English warships were seizing Dutch merchant vessels, claiming they violated the Navigation Acts. Dutch convoys were fighting back. Both nations' pride was wounded from the previous war. King Charles II of England, pressured by merchants demanding action against Dutch competition, declared war in March 1665. The Second Anglo-Dutch War began with England confident of quick victory. The English fleet had been modernized, new ships had been built, tactics had been refined. Admiral George Monck, Duke of Albemarle, veteran of the First Anglo-Dutch War and one of England's most experienced commanders, would lead the fleet to crush the Dutch and establish English naval supremacy permanently. The Dutch, however, had advantages England underestimated. Their admiral, Michiel de Ruyter, was arguably the greatest naval commander of the age, tactically brilliant, personally brave, beloved by his sailors. The Dutch had spent heavily on fleet expansion, and they had something intangible but crucial. They were fighting for survival. If England controlled the seas, Dutch trade died. If Dutch trade died, the Republic died. This wasn't about pride or territory. This was existential. The first year of war went badly for England. At the Battle of Lowestoft in June 1665, England won tactically but failed to destroy the Dutch fleet. Then the Great Plague struck London, killing 100,000 people and disrupting naval administration. England was fighting a war while its capital city collapsed into chaos. By May 1666, England faced a strategic dilemma. France had allied with the Dutch, threatening to join the war. English naval resources were stretched thin. Admiral Monck commanded the main fleet in the Thames estuary, watching the Dutch coast. But intelligence suggested that a French fleet might be sailing from the Mediterranean to join the Dutch. England made a fateful decision: divide the fleet. Send Prince Rupert, yes, the same Rupert who'd fought in the English Civil War 20 years earlier, south with 20 ships to intercept the French. Leave Monck with about 80 ships to face the Dutch alone. The logic seemed sound. The combined Franco-Dutch fleet would outnumber any single English force, so better to defeat them separately. The intelligence was wrong. There was no French fleet coming. It was possibly deliberate Dutch disinformation. By the time Rupert sailed south, de Ruyter was already approaching with the entire Dutch fleet, 85 ships, knowing that Monck's divided force was vulnerable. On June 1st, 1666, English scouts sighted the Dutch fleet approaching from the northeast. Monck realized immediately that he'd been deceived. Rupert was gone, chasing a phantom. The Dutch had their entire fleet, and Monck was outnumbered. Any sensible commander would have retreated, fallen back to the Thames, waited for Rupert to return, then fought with combined strength. But Monck was not a cautious man. He'd spent his career attacking, winning through aggression and courage. Retreat would surrender the initiative to de Ruyter, and Monck believed, perhaps overconfidently, that English seamanship and gunnery could overcome Dutch numbers. On the morning of June 1st, 1666, Monck gave the order: engage. The English fleet, sailing in line ahead, ships following each other in a long column, moved to intercept the Dutch. De Ruyter responded, forming his own line. By late morning, The two fleets were sailing parallel courses, about a mile apart, moving slowly through calm seas. Around 2 p.m., the first shots were fired. The Battle of the 4 Days had begun. The opening engagement followed standard naval tactics of the era. Ships in parallel lines, firing broadsides as they passed each other. But within hours, the neat formations dissolved into chaos. Ships maneuvered for advantage, trying to cross enemy bows or sterns where they could fire devastating raking shots down the length of enemy hulls. Individual ships engaged in deadly duels, pounding each other at close range. The first day's fighting was brutal. English gunnery was excellent. Royal Navy crews could fire faster and more accurately than most opponents. But the Dutch had numbers. For every English ship engaging one Dutch vessel, another Dutch ship was maneuvering to assist. English ships were taking fire from multiple directions, unable to concentrate their own fire effectively. By evening of the first day, several English ships were crippled. HMS Swiftsure, overwhelmed by multiple Dutch ships, was captured. Admiral Sir William Berkeley, commanding Swiftsure, refused to surrender and was killed fighting on his own deck. HMS Loyal George was so badly damaged it had to withdraw. But darkness brought a temporary respite. The fleet separated, tending their wounded, repairing damage, preparing for the next day. Here's a question worth considering. After the first day, with several ships lost and facing superior Dutch numbers, should Monck have retreated? He'd proven English courage. Honor was satisfied, but he chose to keep fighting. Was this brilliant determination or stubborn pride? Let me know in the comments. June 2nd, 1666. Dawn. Both fleets were exhausted, battered, but still operational. Monck reformed his line and sailed to engage again. De Ruyter, confident after the previous day's success, advanced to meet him. The second day's fighting was even more intense than the first. By now, both fleets were fighting through cumulative damage. Ships that had been hit the previous day were less maneuverable, less able to maintain formation. Wounded men filled the surgeons' cockpits. Ammunition was being depleted. But neither admiral would disengage. Pride, determination, and strategic necessity kept both fleets locked in combat. The English ship Prince Royal, Vice Admiral Sir George Ayscu's flagship, became isolated. Dutch ships surrounded it. For hours, Prince Royal fought alone against 5 Dutch warships. The ship was battered into a wreck. Ayscu finally surrendered after his masts were shot away and the ship was sinking. Another English flagship captured, another admiral taken prisoner. But the English were giving as good as they got. English gunnery dismasted several Dutch ships. The Dutch flagship Zeven Provinciën was badly damaged. Several Dutch ships withdrew, too crippled to continue fighting. The casualties on both sides were appalling. Hundreds dead, thousands wounded, ships leaking and burning across miles of ocean. As the second day's fighting ended, Monck faced reality. He was losing, not in one dramatic defeat, but through slow attrition. Every day of battle cost him ships he couldn't replace. The Dutch could afford losses better than England. If he kept fighting, de Ruyter would eventually overwhelm him through sheer numbers. That night, Monck made a decision that saved the English fleet. Retreat. Not flee, but conduct a fighting withdrawal. Sail west toward the Thames while maintaining formation, forcing the Dutch to attack his rear guard rather than his entire fleet. It was the hardest maneuver in naval warfare, requiring discipline and skill when both were nearly exhausted. June 3rd, 1666. The third day. Monck's retreat began at dawn. His damaged ship sailed ahead, protected by his best vessels, forming a rear guard. De Ruyter pursued, sending his fastest ships to harass the English rear. The third day became a running battle, constant skirmishing, English ships turning to fire at pursuing Dutch vessels, then resuming their retreat. The rear guard took terrible punishment. HMS Royal Catherine fought a desperate action against several Dutch ships, barely escaping. HMS Henry was surrounded and captured. But Monck's strategy was working. By spreading out the combat, he prevented De Ruyter from concentrating overwhelming force against any single part of his fleet. And then, late on June the 3rd, sails appeared on the western horizon. Prince Rupert was returning with his 20 ships. Monck had held for 3 days. Now reinforcements were arriving. The odds were evening. Rupert's arrival transformed the battle. The combined English fleet now numbered about 75 ships against De Ruyter's 85, much closer to parity. More importantly, Rupert's ships were fresh, their crews rested, their magazines full. Monck's exhausted fleet could now hand off combat to fresh ships while they withdrew to repair. June 4th, 1666. The fourth day. Both admirals knew this would be decisive. The English couldn't afford another day of attrition. The Dutch needed to finish the English fleet before more reinforcements arrived. It would be a fight to the finish. The fourth day's battle was the most intense of all. Both fleets formed lines and sailed directly at each other, passing at close range with every gun firing. The noise was beyond description. Over 1,500 cannon firing continuously, the crash of shot hitting timber, the screams of wounded men, the snap of breaking masts and rigging. The smoke was so thick that ships could barely see their immediate neighbors, let alone coordinate with the rest of the fleet. English and Dutch ships engaged in close-quarters duels that lasted hours. HMS Resolution fought the Dutch ship Zevenwolden until both ships were wrecks. The Dutch ship Loyalen exploded after a lucky shot hit its magazine, killing its entire crew in seconds. The English ship Black Bull was captured by Dutch boarding parties after brutal hand-to-hand fighting on its decks. The turning point came in the afternoon. The wind shifted, giving the English the weather gauge, the favorable upwind position that allowed them to control engagement distance. Monck and Rupert immediately exploited this advantage, concentrating their fire on the Dutch center. Several Dutch ships were badly damaged. De Ruyter's line began to waver, but the English were equally battered. Ships had been fighting for 4 days. Masts were shot away. Hulls were holed. Casualties were staggering. Perhaps a quarter of the crews on some ships killed or wounded. Ammunition was running low. Monck's flagship Royal Charles had been hit hundreds of times and was barely seaworthy. Around 6 p.m., as the sun began to set on the fourth day of continuous battle, both admirals made the same calculation. Neither side could achieve decisive victory. Both fleets had fought themselves to exhaustion. The Dutch had slight numerical superiority, but terrible casualties. The English had inflicted heavy damage, but lost more ships. Neither could continue. De Ruyter ordered a withdrawal. Monck, too exhausted to pursue effectively, let him go. The fleets separated. The 4 days' battle was finally over. The casualties were catastrophic by any measure. English losses: approximately 1,500 killed, 3,000 wounded, 2,000 captured, and 10 ships lost. Dutch losses: approximately 2,000 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 4 ships lost. Both fleets were shattered. Both navies required months to recover. Who won? That's debated even today. The Dutch inflicted heavier losses and captured more ships, a tactical victory. But they failed to destroy the English fleet, which remained a threat, a strategic draw. English propaganda claimed victory because they'd held the field at the end. Dutch propaganda claimed victory because they'd captured English flagships and admirals. The truth is that both sides bled themselves white for minimal strategic gain. From an English perspective, the 4 days' battle was near disaster averted by luck and courage. Monck's decision to fight outnumbered was reckless, but his fighting retreat prevented total catastrophe. Rupert's return saved the fleet from destruction. English seamanship and gunnery had proven equal to the Dutch, but English strategic planning, dividing the fleet based on false intelligence, had nearly lost the war. The battle also revealed the true cost of naval warfare in the age of sail. 4 days of continuous combat was unprecedented. Ships weren't designed for such sustained action. Neither were men. The exhaustion was total. Sailors sleeping at their guns during brief lulls, surgeons operating non-stop for 4 days, commanders making life-or-death decisions while their bodies screamed for rest. This wasn't glorious naval combat. This was industrial-scale killing, sustained for 96 hours until both sides simply couldn't continue. King Charles II, receiving news of the battle, was shocked by the losses. England had expected quick victory. Instead, they'd barely survived. The cost of building replacement ships, repairing damaged vessels, and paying the Navy was bankrupting the Treasury. The war was becoming unsustainable. But Charles couldn't end it yet. English pride demanded revenge. The merchants who'd pushed for war demanded Dutch commerce be crushed. So the war continued for another year, culminating in an even worse disaster: the Dutch raid on the Medway in 1667, where De Ruyter sailed up the Thames, burned English ships in their own dockyards, and towed away the English flagship Royal Charles as a trophy. That humiliation, coming just a year after the 4 days' battle, finally forced England to negotiate peace. The Treaty of Breda in 1667 ended the Second Anglo-Dutch War with minimal changes to pre-war status. Both nations were exhausted, bankrupt, and desperate for peace. The war had achieved almost nothing, except demonstrating that neither England nor the Dutch Republic could decisively defeat the other at sea. The lesson would shape naval strategy for decades. Supremacy in the age of sail required not just courage or tactics, but industrial capacity to build fleets faster than enemies could sink them. Yet the 4 days' battle established something important for England: determination. For 4 days, outnumbered and battered, the English fleet had refused to quit. Ships fought until they sank. Admirals died on their own decks rather than surrender. This established a tradition, perhaps foolish, perhaps glorious, that Royal Navy ships don't retreat, don't surrender, and don't give up no matter the odds. That tradition would be invoked at Trafalgar, at Jutland, And in both world wars, whenever English ships faced overwhelming opposition, de Ruyter became a Dutch national hero, celebrated for defeating the English fleet. His tactics, aggressive engagement, rapid maneuvering, concentration of force, became standard for the Dutch Navy. Statues of de Ruyter still stand in Dutch cities today, commemorating the admiral who proved the Republic could stand against Europe's great powers. The 4 days battle also demonstrated the evolution of naval tactics. The line of battle, ships forming a long column, firing broadsides, had proven devastatingly effective. Navies would refine this formation over the following century, but the basic concept born in Anglo-Dutch wars would dominate naval thinking until the age of steam. The battles showed that victory came not from individual ship actions, but from coordinated fleet maneuvers, concentrated fire, and maintaining formation under the most extreme pressure. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the brutal realities of warfare, the forgotten battles that shape naval thinking, the moments when men fought beyond human limits, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. What other brutal naval battles should we cover? The battles that lasted days, the sieges that lasted months, the wars that exhausted empires. Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.